your position?
And I-24 News London correspondent Jonathan Sacerdoti is joining us now from London. Thanks for joining us, Jonathan. Good to have you.
Good to be with you.
So what's in the report, Jonathan?
Well, he's just announcing the report right now. Taking to the podium a few moments ago, John Chilcot has been explaining very briefly what is in his report. And I say very briefly because it runs into many millions of words. This is a report that has been 7 years in the coming, over 13 years since that war, and people have long awaited the findings of the inquiry. Now he's giving the highlights, the headlines, so to speak, of what exactly is in the report. Journalists have been able to read the report in a locked room since 8 a.m. this morning, and then at 11 a.m. the announcement has been made. Also with those journalists were some politicians given that preview time to speed read those words, and also some of the families of the British service personnel who were killed during the Iraq War. So far, what he has told us is that the UK chose to join the invasion of Iraq before the peaceful options for disarmament had been exhausted. And he also said that judgment about the severity of the threat posed by weapons of mass destruction were presented without a certainty, with a certainty that was not justified. And he went on, of course, to say that despite warnings that the consequences were not properly planned for of the war, and that the government failed to reach its stated objectives in that war. So far, John Chilcot is not holding back in some of his criticisms, even of Tony Blair, the then Prime Minister, who has long faced accusations from anti-war campaigners that he lied and brought Britain into that war, despite knowing that there were no weapons of mass destruction.
In fact, indeed, it does sound like he's not holding back, but I do wonder what sort of effect will this report have, since it's so long after the case that it is in fact released?
Well, what Chilcot says is that all of these warnings that he's giving in this report are intended to help future planning for British military intervention. He says that he believes that there should be better analysis and planning before Britain goes to war at such a scale. And that has really been the case, because the Iraq War and the aftermath has proven to have altered British foreign policy in a way that has still not worn off. The effect is lasting, and some have even said that Britain's failure to intervene militarily in Syria has actually had the opposite effect, which is to cause a civil war there, just like the civil war caused by intervening militarily in Iraq. This shows, in fact, the big scar that this war has left on the British psyche and on the Western psyche, making people very war-wary. Chilcot has said that Blair was warned that military action might increase the al-Qaeda threat to the UK and might see weapons transferred into terrorist hands, which is something that has also, in the aftermath, affected the British psychology regarding going to war in the Middle East. He also said that Mr. Blair was informed that there was a weapons of mass destruction threat, but it's now clear that the case for war was made, he said, on the basis of flawed intelligence assessments. Yeah. So that gives Blair some wriggle room, because Blair has always maintained that even though the weapons of mass destruction were not found, at the time he made the decision, the intelligence he was given, that he was judging based on that intelligence, he said it made the case that there was this case for war based on the weapons of mass destruction. And finally, Chilcot has also said that Tony Blair told MPs that at some point in the future, the threat from Iraq's weapons of mass destruction would be real. But Chilcot said that Blair presented that intelligence about those weapons of mass destruction with what he called a certainty that was not justified.
I see. Now, with Tony Blair being out of office, of course, will it have any influence on him, all these very difficult findings?
There are protesters right now in Westminster outside Queen Elizabeth Hall, where this event is taking place to launch the actual publication of the report. Those protesters from the Stop the War coalition have always been against that war in Iraq. They were against it at the time and rallied record numbers of people to the street back then. It's their hope that Tony Blair will face some sort of war crimes trial for his involvement, but that seems highly unlikely. Chilcot has said that his report does not touch on the legality of Britain entering that war, because he says only a properly convened legal court could actually make that judgment. But there does seem to be room for Blair to stand behind the defence he has always maintained, which is that with the intelligence he had at the time, he did make the choice to go to war, and he did require that UN resolution in such a way that it was legal. there is some discussion already in the Chilcot report announcement that that legal advice was far from definitive, that he had been told a further resolution would be necessary, and then that was modified to say that it wouldn't necessarily be necessary. So there is this discussion still that will probably carry on for many years over whether or not this was a legal war. And Jeremy Corbyn, who is hanging on to power in the Labour Party as the leader of the party, despite rebellion from many of his MPs, has been said to have been doing so by some because he was waiting for this day for much of the last 13 years.
Right.
That is to say, the day when he could criticise Tony Blair, the former Labour Prime Minister, for that decision to go to war. Yeah. Jeremy Corbyn, of course, was always very critical of that war and has said that it was an illegal war. So this may be the day that he's been waiting for the last week or two.
Yeah. Lastly, as there is a lot on the British public's plate at the moment, how much attention is this report going to get there?
This report's getting a huge amount of attention, despite the very active news cycle here, what with the Brexit referendum vote, the Conservative Party leadership contest, which will see a new Prime Minister put in office without a general election, the rebellion against Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party, and yet failure of that party to have a leadership contest. Despite all of those things, the Chilcot report has been so long awaited that it is now the main news item for the day. It will be, for at least today, pretty much the only news anyone is discussing here. And in fact, some might say that cynical politicians might choose to bury other bad news on this day because it won't make it into that cycle.
Right. Jonathan Sacerdoti in London, thank you so much.